As a review, there are a couple of things that we are trying to do together. We are taking a look at Old Testament stories. We are trying to see what kind of truth we can find in those stories. And then the second thing we're trying to do together is figure out how we apply that truth to our lives. So today we are going to pick back up with the story of Abraham. Last week we did pretty well. Honestly, we made it through almost 8 chapters kind of quickly. But before we do that, we're going to do just a little bit of review from last week, but I want to jump back just a little bit farther still, because this is week 6. So that means when we started, we said we were going to do 10 weeks of this. So we are over the halfway point. And I feel like this is a great place for us to pause for just a minute and look back at what we did on week 1 and have just a real quick conversation. Because in week 1, we spent some time looking at Luke chapter 24. And in Luke 24, we talked about how Jesus, in his resurrected form, was walking down the road with 2 guys, and he essentially did a Bible study with these 2 guys after he was risen from the dead. And he explained to them, Luke says, all that we find in the scriptures. And it says that he explained that the scriptures were about him. The Old Testament, the law, the prophets were teaching about Jesus. And he explains to these 2 men as they're walking down this road how everything we find in the Old Testament is actually about him. And it's an important idea when we start looking back and talking about how do we interpret these texts. It has to be the foundation of how we dive into what we're reading. I think it's equally important that we also do our absolute best to try to understand what the text meant to the people who wrote it. This is a Hebrew text. It's not a Christian text as we're studying these first books of our Old Testament. And because of that, it's important we understand how they interpreted and read and applied what they were working with, because those same truths should still apply to the way we interact with our God as we filter through the lens of Jesus. And so I think it's important that we do both things. One of the other things we talked about right out of the gate in week 1 was the idea that as followers of Christ, we have an ideal life that we are pursuing. It was the life that Jesus lived. In fact, Jesus said, "Follow me," right? Then we have all of these texts in the New Testament that teach us how to essentially live the life that Jesus lived. And so we're in pursuit of this ideal life. Then we have an image of what that looks like in Christ. But for these guys who were studying the Old Testament texts, they didn't have an ideal life. What they had was an ideal text. And so as they were reading these stories, all of these stories about different characters in the Old Testament, different characters in the history of not only their faith, but in their nation and in the world, they were extrapolating from that what it meant to live as light in the darkness, what it meant to live as someone who brings order to chaos, what it meant to essentially live as an image bearer of God. And we watch this idea get played out in the texts. And so these people who studied this text and lived with it, even for the 12 or 1300 years before Jesus showed up, they were studying what they believed to be an ideal life, but they had to get to that through the lens of the text. And that's some of what we spent last week doing as we were talking about Abraham. We went really, really quickly through, and like I said earlier, almost 6 chapters of Genesis, 7 chapters of Genesis, trying to extrapolate this picture of what it meant for Abraham, what he believed living the ideal life meant. And we began in Genesis chapter 12, where we watched as God gave Abraham his calling. He invited him to leave his home and his father's house. And as he did, God said, "As you go, be a blessing." And we talked quickly last week, maybe not quickly last week, but it's going to be quick this time, I promise. we talked quickly about how that idea in the Hebrew text was a command. It wasn't an option for Abraham. He wasn't given a calling that allowed him choice to either kind of do whatever he wanted and watch God bless him. What we find in the text is that God commanded him, you must be a blessing. And so Abraham's calling came with an obligation. It was an obligation to be a blessing to the people around him. Now, we also watched as Abraham kind of played out what he thought that meant. And we watched that happen through these stories. Okay, so in Genesis 15, we watch as Abraham's obligation to his calling gets played out as he mediates a separation between he and Lot. And so they split up. They go two different directions in the land. Abraham essentially tells Lot, look at everything around you and you take your choice. You pick. If you go left, I'll go right. If you go right, I'll go left. Whatever you want in front of you, you can have, and I'll take what's left over. And so we see Abraham begin to flesh out this idea of what it means to be a blessing in the way he interacts with his family. Right? So he mediates a covenant, essentially, between himself and Lot to keep peace and to keep order and allow them to separate in a way that gives Lot the best choice. And Abraham takes what's left. So we immediately see in this story, chapter 15, what Abraham thought it meant to be a blessing. What's my obligation? My obligation is to interact with my family in a way that allows them to choose what they believe is the best thing for them. And then I live in what's left, essentially. Well, hopefully we'll come back to that idea here in just a little bit because I think it's really, really important. The second thing we see, we talked about last week, about Abraham fleshing out his obligation to be a blessing, happens in Genesis chapter 17, where God essentially creates a covenant with him, with Abraham, and he says to Abraham, you must walk before me and be blameless, right? And as you do that, you must be circumcised. And if you meet these two obligations of our new agreement, you are going to have an everlasting relationship with me. And so there's this, we start to trace this idea through the story of obligation. Abraham interacts with Lot in a way that creates Lot's ability to be at peace with the world around him. Then God steps back in and says, here's another covenant. Okay, and so there's this belief and land covenant. There's this action and relationship covenant. And then we find that Abraham once again mediates another covenant between humans. And let's jump into this, right? This is chapter 18. So we talked last week as these three visitors show up in chapter 18. And it's our story of Sodom and Gomorrah, right? So three visitors come. It's God and two angels. They have this interaction with Abraham. Then Abraham does this crazy thing where God tells him, we're getting ready to go to Sodom. And when we get there, we're going to destroy it. And so then Abraham has this exchange where he says, okay, God, before you destroy Sodom, hear me out. What if there are 50 righteous people living there, right? And God's like, well, if there's 50, I won't destroy it. And then Abraham comes back and says, well, what if there's 45? And God says, well, for 45, I won't destroy it. And they have this exchange that goes all the way down to 10. And by the time they get to 10, Abraham has now stopped God 6 times and said, God, what if? Wait, hold on, let's renegotiate. 50, 45, 40, 30, 20, 10. The number 6, by the way, is kind of an interesting place to stop, because if you remember a handful of weeks ago, we talked about the idea that 7 is the Hebrew number of completion. Right? Abraham doesn't get to 7, and Sodom gets destroyed. I'm not saying that means anything. It's just interesting to note. Right? But so there's these 6 exchanges. Well, we talked last week about what was actually happening. Abraham is fleshing out what he thinks it means to be a blessing. He's acting as a mediator between God and the righteous people that are living in Sodom. But what he's doing is a little bit bigger than that even, because what he's doing is he's acting as a mediator, not just on behalf of the people who are righteous, but he's acting as a mediator on behalf of all of the people even who aren't. So Abraham is essentially stepping between God and the city of Sodom, both the righteous and the unrighteous, and saying, God, you can't destroy these people if some of them are good. Right? And so we see Abraham flesh out this be a blessing thing by the way he interacts with his family. And we watch him flesh it out by the way he stands between God and humankind as a mediator, a bringer of peace. God, wait, don't destroy them if they aren't all evil. Well, as the story continues, we move on from Sodom and Gomorrah. And again, now we're going to make some big leaps, okay, in both time and text. But as we move on, we find that God does destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, and Lot and his daughters escape. Abraham's nephew Lot and his daughters escape. And then we find ourselves in chapter 20. And in chapter 20 of Genesis, Abraham is getting ready to repeat a mistake he's already made, which is kind of interesting. Okay, but what we find in Genesis 20 is that Abraham and Sarah move into a new region. They take some new land, and as they do, they run into a guy named Abimelech. And Abimelech is the king of the area they're moving into. And Abraham, once again, says to Sarah, look, we don't know these guys. They might be good guys. They might be terrible guys. My life could be in danger because of you. So instead of saying you're my wife, let's just say you're my sister. Now, we've done this before. Right? We did this in Egypt, clear back in chapter 13. But Abraham's repeating this cycle. Okay? And Abimelech, the king of this land, hears that Abraham and Sarah have moved into the land. And of course, like we could probably guess is going to happen, he takes Sarah into his household to be his wife. Abraham, for lack of a better way to talk about it, allows this to happen, which is also crazy in my head. But now, what happens in chapter 20 is a little different than what happened last time. And so here we go. Verse 4. Now, let me back up into verse 3. Abimelech has taken Sarah. But God came to Abimelech in a dream one night and said to him, you are as good as dead because of the woman you have taken. She's a married woman. Now Abimelech had not gone near her, so he said, Lord, will you destroy an innocent nation? Did he not say to me, she's my sister, and didn't she also say he's my brother? I've done this with a clear conscience and with clean hands. And then God said to him in the dream, yes, I know you did this with a clear conscience, and so I have kept you from sinning against me. That is why I did not let you touch her. Now return the man's wife, for he is a prophet, and he will pray for you, and you will live. But if you do not return her, you may be sure that you and all yours will die. Now, as this story keeps going, man, God shows up in this king's dream and says, give his wife back. The king's like, okay, deal. But what we find as we keep reading is Abimelech is sick. And all of the women in his household, the text tells us they've been unable to bear children. So I don't know how long this has gone, but however long Sarah has been in Abimelech's house, it's been long enough for them to recognize, like, gosh, no one's getting pregnant. This is kind of crazy. Abimelech finds himself sick, and God says to him, you go find this lady's husband, and you have him pray for you, because he's your only way out of this. So now, Guy takes Abraham's wife, okay? Moves her into his house. Abraham's scared to death, clearly, otherwise he would have put up a fight in the first place. But he's a little too afraid to do anything about it. But now he has to act again as a mediator between God and a person to heal this guy. Right? So he does. Abimelech brings him his wife back and is like, dude, I didn't touch her, and I'm super sorry about all of this. Please heal us. Abraham prays for him. The text tells us that he's healed. In verse 17, then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, his wife, and his slave girls so they could have children again. So what do we find out once again happens when Abraham is interacting in his world? We see through the story that Abraham steps in as a mediator once again between God and mankind, right? And if we just keep thinking about these stories through the perspective that Jesus talked about in Luke 24, these are not, they're not complex stories to figure out, right? Jesus steps into the world and says, guess what, guys? There is now someone who stands between you and God. And my job is to orchestrate a peace treaty between the divine and his creation of mankind. In fact, we're even told in the text that Jesus is the mediator between God and man. And I know I'm using the word mediator when I talk about Abraham. The text doesn't, but it's still a perfect picture of how he's behaving. Right? And so we see Jesus every time Abraham has an interaction in these stories with one of the kings or one of the people. Every time he's moving through this country and he's navigating his world, he's doing it in a way that attempts to bring peace between not only himself and others, but between others and God. And that's a really, really cool concept. But what I want us to watch is we are going to see something pretty crazy happen with Isaac too as we move forward in the story. So we are going to actually skip Genesis 22. Now, Genesis 22 is the story of Abraham sacrificing his son, and we're only going to skip it for about 5 or 10 minutes because we're going to come back and wind up our time together focused on that particular story. But I want us to see what happens as we jump forward. So in Genesis chapter 21, God fulfills his promise to Abraham, and Abraham and Sarah have their son Isaac. Isaac is the promised child that God had said would be theirs so that they could essentially populate the entire nation of Israel moving forward. And that's exactly what happens. God grants them a son in their old age. Now, when we trace the story forward, we find the first time God really interacts with Isaac, Abraham dies in Genesis chapter 25. And in Genesis chapter 26, God shows up and has a conversation with Isaac. Now, what's interesting about Genesis 26 and God's conversation with Isaac is that God essentially steps into Isaac's space, world, history, and repeats the original covenant with Abraham. Okay? He says in chapter 5, in verse 5 of chapter 26, because Abraham obeyed me and kept my requirements, my commands, my decrees, and my laws, God is going to do for Isaac what he was going to do for Abraham, and he outlines that in the first few verses of chapter 26. Right? Let's start at verse 2. The Lord appeared to Isaac and said, don't go to Egypt. Live in the land where I will tell you to live. Now we're going to pause right there because I want us to jump all the way back to Genesis. The very, very first conversations we were having about descent into chaos. When we read in the text, don't go to Egypt, we should already be thinking God is trying to keep Isaac out of the chaos. That's an interesting idea, but let's keep going. Verse 3. Stay in this land for a while. I will be with you and will bless you. For to you and your descendants I will give all of the lands. I will confirm the oath I swore to your father Abraham. I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and I will give them all these lands, and through your offspring all the nations will be blessed. We're finding the same language here that we see as God makes this promise to Abraham the generation before. Now, what's interesting about Genesis 26 is as we keep reading, we find Isaac has an interaction with Abimelech, the same king we were just talking about. And Abimelech eventually comes to Isaac with a group of kings and says, man, you are incredibly powerful. You have wealth, you have animals, you have land. We're nervous that as you keep growing, you're going to eventually try to attack us and kill us all and take what we have. So we want you to make a covenant with us, to make an agreement with us that says you're not going to kill us, essentially. And so Isaac does. Now, what's interesting about this to me is I'm not sure we should have expected anything else. But it's interesting to sign an agreement with people who are enough weaker than you that an agreement is not necessary for you. Now, here's what I mean. Like, these guys are scared to death of Isaac and his collection of property. And when we watched Abraham call a trained army out of his household, you have to assume Isaac is in a very similar position at this point, especially because he now has everything his father had, plus everything he's been able to acquire. And so Isaac literally is in a position of power. And these kings, this group of kings, come to him and say, hey, look, let's make a contract where none of us have to die, and you don't come and take all of our stuff. Man, if I'm Isaac, in the back of my head, I'm hesitant, and I'm hesitant to sign it. And the reason I am is because I don't need to sign it, right? These guys are scared of me. I have the ability, at some point down the road, I could have the ability to go, gosh, I want that kingdom too, and go take it. And that idea, the idea that Isaac is strong enough to pull this off, is inherent in the text when these kings show up and say, man, please stay at peace with us. Please. But Isaac, very similarly to what we watch Abraham do, Isaac enacts a covenant of peace between himself and these people around him. What's interesting about that to me is it's entirely possible that the people around him are going to rely on Isaac to keep the peace moving forward because he's the one with the power. It's an interesting idea too. But what I wanted us to touch on and watch is Isaac takes this obligation to be a blessing, and he watches his father do it, to do it between people, to do it between God and people, and then we watch Isaac do the exact same thing. I will make a covenant of peace with the people around me. And so we trace this obligation from Abraham's very first calling all the way through Isaac, and we can watch as the generation after Abraham still says, it's important that I interact with the people around me in a way that brings peace. Peace between man and man. And it's important that I interact with the people around me in a way that brings peace. Peace between God and man. And these two relationships vertically between people and horizontally, that was awesome. Horizontally between God, it's important that to be a blessing to the people around me, to act as the one who brings order from chaos, to act as the one who brings light into darkness, to act as the one who bears the image of God. My responsibility is to initiate and breed and help peace move into the world around me by not only creating peace between myself and the people around me, but helping the people around me create peace between themselves, and then pointing them back up. Here's how we have peace with God. Here's how you can be in right standing with God. And this is what we find Jesus does in the New Testament, right? He shows up and he says, you have two commands, two most important, the two things that matter. Love the people around you and love the Lord your God. And in doing that, you should be creating peace as you move out into your world. Now, the word peace in Hebrew, the way I'm using it is not the way we typically think of it. When we think of the word peace, we have a tendency to think of an absence of conflict. This is not what the nation of Israel thought or believed in the Old Testament when we find the word peace. The word peace, shalom in Hebrew, means much more than an absence of conflict. It includes that idea, but it also includes the ideas of wholeness and health and prosperity. And there's this concept that when I say to someone, may the Lord's peace be with you, I'm not saying necessarily, gosh, I hope you don't have any conflict or any struggle in your life. What I am saying is, I hope the Lord pours out blessing on you in a way that overwhelms you with abundance and health and the health of your family and wealth and good things. And man, even you could even push this idea so far as to say, I'm asking God to give you good things to taste and good things to touch. It's a massive idea that encompasses our entire lives, not just the places in our lives we find conflict, right? So Jesus shows up and he says, I have come that you can have peace with God, peace with each other, but the idea is much bigger than just an absence of conflict with God. It's much bigger than just an absence of conflict with each other. It's an idea that encapsulates the absolute best of everything around us. Now, I'm definitely not saying, as lots of men throughout history have, that God's desire for us is that we don't suffer, or that God's desire for us is that we be extremely wealthy, or that God's desire for us is that we own the nicest things and have constant access to, money we can throw away and burn. This is not what I think Jesus meant when he said, I have come that you may have an abundant life, right? I don't think he's talking about wealth and status, but it's interesting when we come back and start talking about what it means to mediate an idea of peace between mankind and between God and mankind. It's interesting that as we talk about what that peace means, we need to think of it as bigger than just the absence of conflict. Now, I'm going to stop right here. We have about 12 minutes left, and I'm going to do my absolute best to get through a whole bunch of information in Genesis chapter 22. Because, man, there's this mark in the life of Abraham and Isaac. And I think to really understand what's happening in all of the story of Abraham and even in the life story of Isaac, what we find in Genesis chapter 22 matters. It's probably one of the most famous stories of the Old Testament, and it's one of the most famous stories of the Old Testament because of what feels like a horrific act on the part of God, a terrible ask, right? So we find that God has promised Abraham a son. After years and years and years, Abraham is 100 years old, essentially. God gives him a son, Isaac. And then in chapter 22, verse 1, we find this. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. And he said to him, Abraham, here I am, Abraham replied. And then God said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. So early the next morning, Abraham got up and saddled his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. And when he had cut enough wood for a burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. We're going to stop there for just a second. So God shows up and he says to Abraham, I want you to go kill your son. In fact, I want you to sacrifice your son to me. And this raises all kinds of crazy speculation about what the heck kind of God is this? What kind of God would ask you to kill your son? What kind of God would ask you to kill this promised heir that, man, for 30 years or 40 years, God's been saying, I promise you will have a son. Nations will be blessed for you. By the way, go kill him. Right? This is bizarre. This is a crazy story. Now, Jesus, we're just going to do this the whole way through this story. We're going to keep stopping and looking at points of this because Jesus tells us in Luke 24 that for us to understand Genesis chapter 2, we can only understand it through the filter of who he is in the story, right? And one of the conjectures I've had, one of the ideas I've played with for a long time about Genesis 22 is the idea that we find in our Old Testament that God grabs people and he essentially takes them and says, I want you to understand one specific piece about who I am. I'm going to give you not a broad sweeping picture of me. I'm going to give you a very intimate knowledge of one piece of what it means to be me. essentially. We watch it happen a handful of times with Moses. And the prophet Hosea is another great example. There are all kinds of points in our Old Testament where God grabs someone and says, I'm going to teach you something about me. And you and I are going to engage relationally over this one piece of who I am. And I think we may not see a better example of this than we find in Genesis chapter 22. Because God says to Abraham, who, by the way, has taken specific action to be in relationship with God, right? God says to Abraham, I want you to kill your son. In fact, I want you to sacrifice your son, and I want you to sacrifice your son in a very specific place. So God sends him to this mountain range and has him, we're getting into some of this in just a minute, but God sends him to this mountain range and has him set up a sacrifice of his own son. Now, what's interesting about that to me is we know, because we got the whole book, we know that in almost 2,000 years after Abraham, God is going to do the exact same thing. God is actually going to sacrifice his own son. And there may not be another human in all of history who could understand what that meant better than Abraham by the end of Genesis 22. And there's something about that idea that I don't know how to make it take the next step, unfortunately. But we watch God in the Old Testament hand people a piece of his own experience and say, now you understand something more about me. And one of the clearest places we watch that happen is in Genesis 22 as we keep going. Abraham is going to end this chapter with an understanding of God, of an experience that God is going to have that maybe none of the rest of us will ever comprehend like he is able to here. It's a strong idea that you can keep wrestling with me, because I don't know how to push it any farther than that. Verse 4. On the third day, that's interesting. On the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. And he said to his servants, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. Abraham took wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. And as the two of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, Father. Yes, my son, Abraham replied. The fire and the wood are here, Isaac said, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? And Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the two of them went on together. And we're going to stop for just a second because there's a couple of really interesting things that just happened. We have a great story of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane the night he was betrayed, and then hanging on the cross. And we watch essentially a one-sided conversation between Jesus and God. And we know in the garden, Jesus was praying, Father, I don't want to do this. I don't want to go through the sacrifice I'm about to go through. I will because it's your will. If you want me to, I will. But man, if you were going to just ask me and let me choose, I would like to pass. Right? We find this happen in the Garden of Gethsemane, and then we find Jesus hanging on the cross saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? Right? Crazy, intense moments in the life of the Savior. We get this snapshot of Jesus' conversation with God. Now, the reason I point that out is because these verses here in Genesis chapter 22, where Isaac speaks, and he says, Father, and Abraham replies, and Isaac's like, where's the offering? And Abraham's like, don't worry, God will take care of that for us. This is the only conversation recorded between Abraham and Isaac. It's the only one in the text. In fact, we're going to find out that from this point forward, we never see Abraham and Isaac together again. That's interesting too. We might dig into that in just a little bit if I still have time, but I want to keep going. So there's this conversation. The only conversation recorded in the text between Abraham and Isaac, and it's about God providing a sacrifice for them. Now, what does that tell me? Should my initial reaction be Abraham is lying to Isaac? I don't think so. Because I think what's happening here, and man, A.W. Tozer wrote about this brilliantly in his book, The Pursuit of God. And what he talked about was Tozer imagined Abraham the night before this sacrifice, up all night, wrestling and arguing and interacting with God, trying to nail it. Are you serious? This is what you want me to do? And Tozer's explanation is that Abraham probably landed at a point where he realized, do you know what? God, if this is what you're asking, I'm going to walk that direction. But my expectation is that you will keep your promise to me, even if that means you have to raise Isaac from the dead. Right? Like, man, you know what? I might do it because this is what you're telling me to do. But if that happens, your promise is so reliable that I believe you will raise him from the dead. What happens when God makes the same sacrifice? Right? Son gets raised from the dead. That's an interesting idea. Let's keep going. So Abraham says to him, God's going to provide a burnt offering. And when they reach the place that God had told him about, I'm going to pause again. There is conjecture. There's an idea. There's at least a very, very reasonably created argument that says where Abraham is standing in the mountains of Moriah, getting ready to sacrifice Isaac, is the exact same geographical location where we find the Golgotha, where they sacrifice Christ, which again paints this into a really interesting story about God and his son. Right? But so they reach the place God had told him about. Abraham built an altar. He binds Isaac. He lays him on the altar on top of the wood. He reached out his hand, took the knife to slay his son, but an angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham. And here I am, he replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy, the angel said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know you fear God because you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Abraham looked up and he saw a ram, and he took it and he sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. And Abraham called this place, the Lord will provide. And to this day it is said, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. I've said for years, but the last couple of weeks here, that this book is not a book about us. It's a book about God. As we study these stories, we learn about God. We learn about who he is. We do learn things about ourselves, but the book is not trying to make me the central point of the story. But the thing that I think is interesting, and the reason I want to just kind of point that out here, is because we watch God walk one of his most beloved servants through an experience that only God will be able to understand. And having said that, and having pointed out several times that, there's so much about Jesus packed into this chapter, we could live there for weeks and never get through it all. One of the things that I want us to do is actually talk about where we fit in this story. If I'm not the hero, if I am not the one willing to sacrifice what matters most in order to be a blessing to all mankind, where do I fit in this story? While we get a very, very clear picture that Isaac is enacting what we're going to watch Jesus do. Right? So Isaac essentially in this story is Christ, and God the Father is Abraham, and we watch this exchange happen. So where am I in this story? I think it's incredibly important that this is the question we are consistently asking. I realize I haven't answered it yet. That this is the question we're consistently asking. If God is the hero and the stories are about Jesus, where do I fit? Now, we could spend the next 10 minutes trying to figure out where that is in this particular story, and I'll try to do that very, very quickly because I'm already out of time. But it's possible, at least a reasonable conjecture, if we talk about the story this way, that we are the servants who tag along, right? There's a couple people standing in the background waiting for Abraham and Isaac to come back off of this mountain having made a sacrifice. Now, these guys had to have understood that this is a significant thing Abraham is doing. They've traveled 3 days to get to where they're going. I'm sure over the course of that time, they've had some conversations with Abraham, who seems to be a pretty personable guy, right? Like, man, where are we going? What are we doing? Well, God gave me a vision of the place I have to get to. This is where we're going. So it's possible that for us, as we interact with the story of Abraham and Isaac, that we find ourselves in the shoes of these men who have kind of really just had the opportunity to tag along and watch Abraham do something. And again, not up close, but they sat back and waited while Abraham did something that seems to be so counter to who God is. Why am I asking you to sacrifice your son? But we, in this story, we have a chance to sit back and to watch as God sacrifices his son to be a blessing to all mankind. Right? And just like these servants spent their lives, man, we only get like one sentence about these guys, but what we know is that they have spent their life serving Abraham. And as they did, they had an opportunity to live in the world he created, mediating peace between man and man and mediating peace between God and man. And it's possible that our role in this story is literally just as simple as standing back and watching God make the ultimate sacrifice for us, so that we now have a model, we now have a specific example of what it means to be made in the image of God in a way that enacts peace between man and peace between man and God. And we'll pick this back up with another story next Wednesday. Thanks for hanging out with me, guys. I appreciate you letting me push a little long, and we'll be right back here next week.